I like the video introduction. It's a great way to get started on the topic. Thanks for coming on the last day of class. And I wanted to talk about, to reflect on a collection of work that we've done, as Michael mentioned, supporting collaboration largely through video, and to think about it in the angle of what is the difference between using video for work or for enterprise and using video for consumer. Most of my research has been focused on the enterprise or work-based video until recently, and I think it's an interesting example because technically, it's the same technology, right? Video calling for video conferencing or for business versus Skype calling for home. It's the same underlying technology, but one of the interesting things in our research recently is we've been noticing how the usage cases are dramatically different between work and home. So I want to just reflect on that a little bit, review a number of projects that we've been doing, and use that to think about, well, what are some opportunities this maybe helps us see in the future? So first, a little history, right? So the first video technology, video phones, did appear in the sort of the consumer space. The famous AT&T PicturePhone back in 1964. If you can see, they did get the use case right. There's apparently a grandmother chatting with their child. But this never really took off, right, in the consumer space. This is back in 1964. Interestingly, a 3-minute call would, in today's dollars, be around $200. And the other interesting thing about it is that it was installed in these, essentially, I'm happy to say this is before my time professionally. So I'm told this happened in public video phone booths installed in like the Grand Central Station in New York and other public places in these cities. So you can kind of see that the deployment infrastructure wasn't there to make this a very ubiquitous technology. They did some commercial, some enterprise services for video phones in Pittsburgh, actually my hometown, in Westinghouse. But at its peak, 500 people subscribed to the AT&T PicturePhone, and it was kind of shut down as a commercial business within about a decade. So it started in the consumer world, video phones. Not in the same area, not too much later. There was a workplace demo, famously the mother of all demos in NLS 1968, which among other things showed multi-person video conferencing. And again, the technology was there for that, but usage was relatively slow in picking up. So like I said, I've spent, in fact, much of my career thinking about how to use video to support people working together, and largely that's been in the workplace setting. Back in the 90s, did an interesting video shared drawing prototype, purely video that allowed two people in potentially different places look like they're kind of sharing the same whiteboard. Back in, again in the 90s, you can tell by that grainy video quality, one of the first digital desktop video conferencing technology systems on Sun workstations. And one of the more interesting things we did is use the fact that it was digital to create some effects. This sort of video window that faded in gradually rather than popped up on your desktop. Because people don't pop up and appear in front of your face. They kind of have a sense of approach and they walk in. And we wanted to try to figure out how we could digitally simulate that by having these video windows fade in and out. But more recently, I worked for Microsoft Research, and Microsoft acquired Skype, and that got our research group, to pivot a little bit and think about, well, all this work we've been doing for the enterprise, what would it mean to think about the consumer or the social or the personal realm? We've actually wanted to do that kind of research for a long time, and now we had a business case. We now had a product group that focused on consumer video. Let's explore some prototypes and some technologies that would support that. I'll talk about experiences ago. Another one that you could find in Kai is a project we did at Home Proxy, which was enabling this sort of video messaging at home, a kind of a standalone appliance that you could walk up to, leave a message, and then leave, and it would take care of sending it to the right person and kind of letting them find out that there was a message for them. And so today, this is sort of like the pinnacle of video conferencing for the enterprise. The Cisco Telepresence system, which advertises itself as kind of making you feel like you're there. I will point out, this really only works for the person in the center. The person in the center gets the views of when people are looking at them and when they're looking elsewhere. The other people don't quite get that sense. And it was sort of optimized for the CEO or the CXO, right? So that person sits in the center. They get the optimized views. The other people are kind of supporting to them. But this is hugely expensive. Not sure how you would characterize it in terms of commercial success. And video in the enterprise has often been motivated by saving travel money, right? How can you get this work done with remote people without actually getting on a plane, spending all that money, and also all the wear and tear on people? And so its motivation, I think, has led to this very practical or utilitarian connecting people. And this really is talking heads, enabling you to see talking heads and interact with each other while you're conducting business. So we did some work, this was published at DIS in 2012, where we specifically asked people who were active using video both at work and at home to reflect on their experiences. This was an open-ended interview study where we asked people, what are the things that you remember doing with video, both at work and at home? And we especially tried to get to elicit what novel experiences or what unique things they were doing with video. This we recruited through basically an email server, a screener that went to both employees in our company, and that sort of mushroomed out to other people or their families. It ended up being around, international, not just Puget Sound. And again, they had to be active users of video and thought that the video was at least moderately important for accomplishing their work. Some demographics about ages and gender balance. And most of them were in some sort of social relationship, in a family or in a relationship. So, and what struck us about this was that most of the interesting things that were happening, what people wanted to really tell us about were the ways they were using video at home, for personal or for social reasons. At work, there were sort of cursory mentions about meetings and things like that. But at home, there was this long list of very diverse and interesting activities. I just want to call out a couple of my favorites. One is, where is that one? Working on a plane together. Where there was a father-son team, and the son was flying his plane somewhere, and it was making a weird sound when the plane landed. So he called his father on his phone and sort of weaseled it up into the engine compartment using the video, using Skype, and said, do you think this is okay? Can I make it home? And the father they did some troubleshooting using the video on the mobile phone, and he basically said, yeah, I think it's okay, and then they went off. So that ability to use this portable device that's in your pocket to connect visually with an expert and get an opinion on a kind of a mechanical problem. The other great example I liked was remote babysitting. So this was a story where two sisters were talking. One was overseas, and the sister here was a mother of a newborn, and she was visibly tired of having a video conference with that person. And so she was there with the baby, and they were talking as sisters do, and she was complaining about how tired she was. And the remote sister, I think she was in Japan, says, you know what? You go take a nap, leave the baby in front of the video camera. I'll call you if anything goes wrong. And sort of provided this sisterly remote babysitting service with technology that, they were confident they could do the alerting if necessary. It was a newborn, so it wasn't going to run away or anything. And so they were able to create this virtual sisterly act of caring for each other's child, even though they were like halfway around the world. And so just really interesting ways in which people were appropriating or using video technology to make these sort of social connections. And I wanted to give just a little example of a compilation that we found on YouTube. This is not of our own work, but of examples of people doing this kind of
meal. Are you enjoying your meal with all your kids?
Yes, I do. It's lovely.
So this is a kind of a telepresent Christmas dinner.
There's Lisa. Lisa,
Everyone
say
has
hi.
their virtual stations.
And where's Philip sitting?
People have places at this table.
Come near the camera. You have to say hi to Mom.
When the evening comes, it's not a peep. Mickey counts his sleeping sheep.
Okay, this is a military dad reading a story.
Can I have a hug?
And this is actually a pre-recorded thing. This is part of her bedtime routine.
I love you, Audra.
But they have this sort of connection.
Here we go.
Another military story of being present at a birth.
Scared.
I know, honey. I know. Hang in there.
Here, I'll hold your hand, and it'll be like Greg holding his hand.
A nice proxy act there.
There's your baby boy. You see him? Okay. You see him?
I can see him.
Good.
And you can see the emotion around. And then another example of attending a wedding remotely. And capturing it in pictures is a big part of demonstrating that, oh yeah, I was there. You know, she actually bought the matching dress even though she wasn't physically there. So ways in which people are using video to be there for social reasons. So we were really struck by this sort of creative use of video in the social world, and that led us to a series of projects that I want to kind of touch on, and then touch on these various projects, return again to the enterprise to see if anything interesting has been happening in the enterprise since then as well, and reflect on some of the opportunities between enterprise and consumer. Okay, so the first one, Video Kids. This was enabling a set of kids to who had a close existing relationship. How are they using video as a way of staying close, even though they saw each other kind of a lot of, like almost every day as well? This is also work that showed up at CHI by many of my colleagues. So the technology is actually very, very simple. Asynchronous video messaging tool. It did support some threading. That is, you could connect those individual messages into conversation threads. But the main goal was to make it as lightweight and easy as possible to connect. And we were just using webcams. Actually, it allowed you to use a webcam and also screen record of what was happening on your computer. You could send that as a message as well. And interface, again, fairly straightforward. This was how you could kind of keep threads of conversations together, and there was a quick way to play through the entire thread. But nothing, pretty straightforward interface. We actually had developed this and given it as a tool for work at first. You know, would people at work use video messaging? And basically, we didn't get very much uptake. The most interesting thing they did was because we deployed it at one of the geographically remote sites, and they gave a kind of a tour, a visual video tour of their new building in, I think, China. But otherwise, they were sort of pretty flat messages about work. But when we gave it to this group of preteen girls, first of all, about 200 messages in the first day. Really quick uptake, lots of conversations, lots of messages sent, and a lot of messages were viewed multiple times. It was about sending and sharing and reviewing and having that connection to the messages. Some of them relatively long threads of messages, 140 or so. But what was striking is just how quickly they used it and appropriated it. And I'll just give an example of some of the video messages that they left with each other. Now remember, this is preteen girls, so it's a lot of fun for them.
Miyako, guess what I had for breakfast this morning? Cereal! Yeah, I had cereal again.
Haley, guess what? I didn't have cereal!
2 pictures of cereal because, you know, cereal.
That's a screen recording.
Good.
And
Hi, Eliza. I love puppets too, and I can't believe you love Lady Gaga. And that's my favorite artist too. And look, Ruta likes Lady Gaga too. She loves Lady Gaga. Okay, bye.
okay, so using that expressiveness of video.
So, hi peoples, I'm going to show you my rock collection. Ready? Let's do this thing.
Okay, wanting to be mobile with it.
Okay, so do you see? Do you see those 2 pink things right there?
And just playing
Okay,
together.
watch us roll in our money. Okay, ready, set, go!
Ready?
Oh.
I am Hermione, then Guardian Leviosa.
So what we thought was interesting about that is their use of video, again, not like you'd find in the workplace, but almost like, even though it was asynchronous, it felt like they were trying to create an activity that they were doing together. So they were remote and they were asynchronous, but it felt like they were creating this kind of shared play space using video, even though it was sort of messaging. And so that got us to wanting to explore, well, what else could we do with video and messaging or video with social people? And it led to another project that we called Experiences to Go. This is originally called Grandma in a Box because that's what the Telepresence robot that Michael referred to is usually called John in the Box. But people didn't like the way Grandma in the Box sounded, so then we call it Grandma to Go, which then broadened because we only had a few grandmothers that use this. But anyway, this was an attempt to take video conferencing out of the home and into the places where kids' activities occur, because a lot of these was driven, of course, by attending kids' activities that might be sporting events outdoors, that might be birthday parties and special venues. And frankly, one of the critiques about Skype is that often a Skype call, your sort of canonical weekly call with Uncle Joe, it often is in the same computer in the same room week after week, connecting those 2 rooms, and not very much as interesting is happening other than the talking faces. So we wanted to try to take that out of that kind of those 4 walls and see, well, what could we do by enabling video conferencing out in the wild? So that led to this rather science fair kind of project where we cobbled together a camera, a camcorder that allowed pan, tilt, and zoom, importantly, because a lot of these kids' events are kind of farther away, and could also deal with lighting. We wanted it to be portable. It's not beautifully portable, but you can throw it in a car or take it someplace. And we used Skype because that was a tool that reached a lot of people. Didn't have to do any customized install on the remote side. And we used a 4G hotspot that allowed it to go virtually anywhere, especially in the Puget Sound area or Silicon Valley area where this work was done. And so this was this portable video terminal, and it had this affordance that there was a tablet there that showed the remote person. So unlike when you record something for a camcorder and you don't see the audience, here we wanted to give the audience a sense of presence, a sense of being able to come up and interact with that person. And so, again, we recruited people to take this out and do what they wanted with it, and we captured lots of diverse activity. Fishing birthday parties, play centers, and a lot of these were, interestingly, though you might think this is kind of targeted for remote people, a lot of these were families where one partner or the other couldn't attend because of scheduling constraints, but wanted to be involved in the event. So a case where let's see, I think in this case, the husband is watching the swim team practice and the wife wanted to join remotely. So they live in the same city, but scheduling-wise, it was they wanted to try this out virtually. And again, just a quick sample of what this looked like. This was a birthday party held at a fish hatchery, and they were connecting with a grandmother at the time. I caught 2 fish.
Here, go in front. Oh, look at right there. Show him.
And so they walk up to it and talk to the grandmother. And in one case, the grandmother could see that they caught a fish and started kind of cheering or applauding even before there was a conversation about it. So it really felt like she could be involved in that interaction. So just some quotes about how people felt in this. A feeling of being part of the activity, that they were sitting there right next to them to share in the activity with their kids, like they were both together. And that was exactly what we were going for, is that video is not just a medium for kind of projecting a talking head, but it's a medium that allows remote people to be part of an activity together. And it actually led to a realization that there are many stakeholders in these kinds of interactions, right? So obviously there's the remote person, the proverbial grandmother that wants to be part of a kid's activity. And then there's the local observer, the sort of person that is helping the grandmother attend. And actually, oftentimes, there's an interesting social interaction between those two, because usually, let's take the grandmother case, usually it's the grandmother's own child, son or daughter, that is doing all this. And so while they're watching 5-year-old soccer, which isn't actually a thrill a minute, they would catch up on their social chit-chat, right? They would have the usual parent-child discussion as if they were sitting in the bleachers together, and the kids' activity was sort of an occasion to come together on that. So it was important to support that interaction as well as showing what's going on with the kids. And then there were the kids, the local people taking part in the activity, who would, from time to time, want to come up and say something directly to grandma, and also would want to have the sense that not only the local people there, but remote people are attending as well. And so they're an interesting part of the stakeholder. And the other stakeholder were the people around the audience. Okay, so can we do this in a way that doesn't seem strange or weird? And this one in particular, this was a high school track and field meet. And this is the one example where the high school daughter came up and said, I don't want to look weird or something because you're doing this thing and watching me. And so she was very aware of the social context of what it would look like that this thing was sitting in the stands watching her. The other thing that happened is that because they were often local people, we actually got a few conversations between the remote person and other bystanders, other people who were attending the event, and we wanted to think about how to afford for that. And that's an interesting question. Think about this compared to, say, Google Glass, where the remote person could be watching something, but you have no awareness of what's going on. It's a little bit like the invisible headset people that you talk to. And so this takes a different approach by making that remote person more real or more visible. Okay. The third project I want to talk about is sharing experiences over video. This you might think of as watching TV together or watching video together. Again, done by a number of colleagues and a summer intern, and presented at Interact last year. And this was actually, this had some interesting parts about the methodology. First, we basically did a survey. Do you ever try to watch TV or videos together with someone remotely? And while you're doing that, have some connection, like a Skype call, or maybe just a phone call, so that you feel like you're watching the program together. So the survey asked if people do that, and if so, how they're doing that. This, again, started with employees at our company and then mushroomed beyond. And we had just a number of basic questions about, tell us more about how you do this and your demographics. An interesting part about this study is that the survey responses came from full-time employees, and this happened during the summer, so there were a lot of summer interns, and there's obviously an age demographic difference there. And that shows up in how people kind of use this. The next thing we did, which was interesting methodologically, is just ask people who do this, who watch videos together, the next time you do it, tell us about it through a survey, and if you'd like to, loop us in on a Skype call. So in other words, they're watching TV together, they have a Skype call going with each other, and they make a Skype call to one of our basically automatic Skype bots that records the conversation for research purposes, and we get to see what's going on in their homes in this case, which is kind of an interesting thing from a research point of view, because we as researchers don't have to go visit all these homes personally. They can just loop us in whenever they do it, whenever the time is convenient for them, and we actually don't have to be there to capture that data. So it was scheduled on their own time. The third part of the study was a lab study where we actually brought people in, tried a couple of different configurations of doing this, and I'll just kind of quickly breeze through that. One is, you're sitting side by side. Another is that the remote person appears as a picture in a picture. It's a really small rectangle on the TV screen. So you're watching the TV and you see the other person remotely. And the third condition was what we call the proxy condition, where you have a screen or kind of a place dedicated for that remote person, and you're again watching together. And a quick example of what this looked like to show what it feels like to kind of share those reactions while you're watching TV together.
I'm sure you don't want to get caught up in anything that's illegal, right?
So the went by quickly, but there was this comment about, oh, you wouldn't want to do anything illegal. And they can share those reactions in nearly simultaneously. There's a slight delay in terms of how it was synchronized.
I'm sure you don't.
So, but the one thing that was interesting for us is that in the survey where we asked, do you do this? Or would you be interested? A small percentage of people did try it, and roughly equal percentage said they wanted to try it, but half of the people said, this basically sounds like too much trouble, or like it wouldn't be satisfying. And yet, in the field study or the lab study, once we did give them the actual experience of trying this, people said, oh, now that I see how I could do this, I'd like to do this again. It suggests that there is this bit of a hump of getting people to actually experience it first. And once they see that it is actually possible with the infrastructure that we have, they would be genuinely more interested in trying this again. So that is another indicator of just sort of getting over the initial hump of, well, I never thought I could do that before. But we do have a technology now that reaches into people's homes that could enable this kind of work. The other interesting thing is that when you broke down by age, obviously more people in the intern demographic were doing and trying this than people that were older. Okay, so I wanted to share about one other experience. And this is actually the experience that kind of sold me on this kind of work. So when I went to CAI in Paris last year, I made a side trip to this castle that's sort of nearby in Pierrefonds. And this was at the request of my younger daughter, who was a big Merlin fan. I don't know if anyone else is into this scene at all. Oh, good. So as you might have noticed, that castle is the scene for Camelot in the series. And my daughter was a big fan and kind of wanted to see, actually she wanted to see what the real castle was like and how that compared to the castle as envisioned in the TV series, because as you cut from scene to scene, you can move between rooms and it has no relationship necessarily to the real castle. So I took a train and a bit of a cab ride to Pierrefonds from Paris, and basically took my iPhone, added a wide-angle lens that allowed to be able to capture a kind of wider field of view, earbuds, of course. And that part was what enabled me to basically have a Skype connection with my daughter back here in California. Additionally, I added a look-see camera that was just to kind of have an asynchronous recording at a higher fidelity, right, that she could watch afterwards. So that was sort of a separate part. There was the synchronous part that was on Skype on the iPhone. The asynchronous part was this head-worn video camera. And to boot, I was using a digital camera that she wanted to get pictures of exact places of. And a little pocket protector just kind of mounted in my pocket in the right way. And do you know how hard it is to get pocket protectors nowadays? It's okay, so this is what it looked like, right? The things you do for your daughter. The Google cap. I wore it because it was the only black cap that I had to sort of mask the look-see camera. If people wanted to think this was a Google Glass prototype, I wasn't going to say anything about that. But anyway, sorry. The main thing, right, I'm just wearing this camera in my pocket, using the back camera forward, walking around, chatting on my earbuds with my daughter. We did the time zone difference so that she did wake up for this, and gave her a tour of the castle. So a little bit to my surprise, I did get 3G service in this remote part of France, and the call lasted for over 2 hours on the iPhone battery. In fact, what it was really limited to is that the castle closed before I kind of got through everything. 1,618 megabytes of data usage, I could tell on my phone bill. And Skype more or less worked throughout the entire time. It did the usual lagging and freezing from time to time, but we were able to have a conversation. And the audio was pretty good throughout most of that time. Look-see, on the other hand, only lasted about 40 minutes, and that's because the battery ran out after that time. Look-see at that time, that's been an issue for that, and it got very hot. And my daughter directed me to take over 200 pictures while I was there. Okay, so I asked the guide that was there if they had Wi-Fi, which would have saved me a lot of money and maybe made it higher fidelity. And he said, no, maybe you should take pictures and show them when you get back. But we had a higher fidelity shared experience in mind. So we did this. And this is a picture of her watching. My wife took this when she was watching it at home. And some comments about that from her point of view, that she had the sense that she got to do this together. She loved directing my father. I suppose you could stop there, but to take pictures, and through audio. It wasn't easy to see because of the blurriness of the video. And another thing she missed is some of the other senses, right? This was only visual. And this last comment that, pictures, especially digital devices, tend to perfect images around lighting, which is not necessarily what it really looks like. And this is a good case in point. This is in the catacombs down in the bottom. And the picture I took from the digital camera actually did an amazing job of lightening it up, whereas in reality, it was almost dark, and you had to kind of walk carefully through because you couldn't see with that amount of, you didn't have that sense of light. Okay. And one of the things that I did as part of this is I picked up a stone and brought it back as a sort of memento that she would have of going to this visit. And you can barely see it. I'm holding the stone right there. And when I showed it to them and I wanted to bring up the video or the picture that corresponded to it, they caught themselves talking this language. It's like, yeah, we were there when you picked it up, because the video camera was still on when I picked it up and took it. So in fact, I didn't have to demonstrate this with the picture. They had this sense that they were part of that activity. So, and this is just a quick video example from the look-see itself. So this is head-mounted. Warning, if you get queasy watching head-mounted video, you might want to close your eyes after a bit. But this is just an example of what that looked like. So you can see the brim of the hat right there. And I pull out the camera. And see, this is the only way I can talk to her, is if I pull it out and look at her. She's guiding me to look at these.
They're the same. They look the same.
These gargoyle downspouts. I'll point it out to you. So she wants me, this one over here. There's some kids. This actually is the guy that said no Wi-Fi.
There was no taxi. Well, I ate lunch after I got out.
And
It's connecting.
we have a short conversation there. But anyway, she wants to look at this gargoyle.
The guy asked about Wi-Fi. I said just take pictures.
And then fortunately, when I get to the spot, Skype freezes up because I'm sort of not in a good spot.
I see. My coverage in this spot is weak.
So I had to walk back.
That's the problem.
Anyway.
Yeah, then that's the other one. That's the other one.
That goes on for a while. That actually, after this is the experience that made me feel like, there's something here about this connection. Let me skip ahead to this one. When I thought about this in terms of my experience, I actually got a lot of her feedback, her excitement of seeing things through the audio channel. So even though I wasn't able to see her face all the time, in part because we have a pretty close tie, we're pretty closely connected, I could get most of that excitement through the audio without having to look at her face. I would have liked to have occasionally looked at it if that was more convenient. And so pulling out of my pocket was not only inconvenient for me, but I realized that disrupted her view of what was going on. So I didn't do that very often. And I did feel a little self-conscious. So, I have this thing in my pocket, I'm walking around, and she wants to see something, and I kind of aim my body that way and aim back. So not the best interface there. But the interesting thing is that this is not a place that I would naturally have gone on my own time in Paris, France, right? But it is something that I wanted to do together with my daughter. And we got that experience that we actually were doing something together, even though we were sort of remote. I will say that there was some bystander curiosity of that. It has a lot to do with, especially the audio. I was trying to be kind of subtle in that, but again, it looked like I was talking to myself, I guess. Then just another point, she did look at the asynchronous video afterwards. Again, it felt like it recreated the experience. It was much higher fidelity, so she got to look at some of the details of, where things had been CGI'd in the show versus they weren't there in real life. And again, this notion of, even though it wasn't real time, I felt I was walking around and I caught myself moving my head around to peek at the corner. I don't know if you've done this, but you're looking at something on your phone and something goes out of view and you sort of move it to sort of think that you can somehow control or get it back into view because there's that illusion that video is putting you in that place with them and that you kind of have some control, even though in this case it was asynchronous and she couldn't do anything to control it. It did kind of present that illusion. Okay, so corny sci-fi joke about going back to the enterprise or the next enterprise. So what's been happening in enterprise space while all this has been happening in the consumer space? Well, in fact, there have been these things. Another example of the robot that Michael mentioned about mobile video in the workplace. This is a technology called the Beam by a company called Suitable Technologies that enables people like me who work remotely to physically move around in that place and participate in meetings much like other people who are seated at the table. And this, in fact, is a project. This is probably the robot that you might have seen me on, where we didn't deal with the robotic movement part. We just had a mobile video terminal, which is a physical proxy that allows me to participate, kind of have a seat at the table. And a lot of this research, what we found out is the difference that it makes to have this sense of physical presence, that if someone turns to the proxy and says, well, what do you think about that? All those deictic references make sense. And all the cues that we use to manage turn taking or manage who's asking whom all work because there's a sort of physical location. This is in contrast to speaking at some black box in the center of a speakerphone or being kind of glued to the wall in larger than life form if you're kind of video conferencing. And so we've been leveraging that, and other companies have commercially looked into that. kind of one of the more interesting things is that it's the social integration of these things that are the more surprising things. So, right, does it really make sense to see a video of someone eating lunch together? But it's the fact that you're doing this, eating lunch together with somebody else. Or there's also a beam soccer game that has been done. I think this was at Willow Garage where they made these things. And at the most recent Chi conference, there was a double robot. This is kind of a more Segway-like thing. You stick an iPad in there, and it becomes a lower cost version of this proxy. And this allowed people to attend talks. In this case, he's turned around and looking at the person who's asking the question. And this is a different person attending at this, Chi at the reception, where you're sort of doing more of this mingling and asking these personal questions. And so there's some exploration of what does video look like in the workplace that is more mobile, more physical, and again, gives this opportunity of being part of an experience. So, reflecting a little bit on this enterprise and consumer usage. What have we learned by kind of looking at these side by side? First of all, for me, I think it's interesting that, as I said at the beginning, the technology stack is essentially the same. And it's the social issues around it that are kind of driving these different uses. So it's a great illustration of a socio-technical system where it's the connection, the collaboration of both of them that create these different use cases. Another thing, and this is, I think, true for both enterprise and consumer, is it's not only for geographically remote. I mean, you might think of video conferencing as mainly enabling people who are in different cities or around the world to come together. But in fact, and what I was trying to convey in this picture, there's a lot of very local uses of video. The proverbial looking at something while I'm shopping and getting an opinion from somebody else to make sure I'm getting the right thing, or very short usages of Snapchat or Instagram to just convey these sort of phatic messages that, hey, I'm thinking about you, even though I'm going to see you when you come home to dinner, I wanted to send this to you now. So there's a lot of local uses of video, not just for remote. I think mobile does make a difference, both in the personal and consumer. You see all these pictures of the fact that these mobile devices in our pockets now allow us to take pictures and share videos with each other, but also in business where many of our meetings are happening on the go and use these mobile devices to support it. But I would also say, think not just of the traditional mobile device, but new forms of mobile devices, which I think the telepresence robots are an example of. And I will say, you know, I'm not a fan of the form factor. I don't think that these mobile robots are necessarily going to be the way of the future, but I am intrigued by the kinds of experiences it enables, that I can be at a social event or kind of a work networking event and have a presence even though I'm remote. So one of the things I will say about my experience at Microsoft, working remotely, although my proxy does a great job for helping me be part of meetings and actually being socially integrated with the team, whenever the team does an offsite or goes to lunch outside, that's where I still feel like there's room for using some of these kinds of technologies to enable me to go along. And so I think that's an area for future work. Another interesting, I think, kind of overlay about this is how the younger generation appears to be much more comfortable and much more literate with video than the older generation, and they're using that. So the popularity of things like Snapchat and Vine to that younger generation feel completely facile with. And we had a recent interview with some high school teenage boys where they just sort of said, yeah, you know, you're on a roller coaster ride, yeah, sure, you just take out a video, 6 seconds, and you're able to share that with other people. This is very kind of unremarkable, I'd say, to a generation of people who are very video literate and have the devices and the infrastructure that they've grown up with, that they can just assume that you can do that. Okay, but the one difference, I think, is that I think work connections are relatively elastic, to use an economic term, or flexible, right? So I have a work problem. I walk down the hall. There's like a half dozen people that could help me with this problem, and I'll pick the one that's available and accessible and approachable. And so I may not go through great lengths to find just the right person because there's a collection of people that will do fine. Whereas personal contacts tend to be sort of inelastic, right? I only have one mother and one father. If I want to share something of my baby with them, I'm going to go through the extra hoops to connect them. And so I think this is what is driving that more creative usage of video in the personal or the consumer realm compared to the workplace realm, because there are special people that wherever they are in the world, we'll try to figure out a way to connect them. And that ends up prompting us to be kind of more creative with that technology. And so one of the themes of our group's work has been moving from talking heads to actually enabling people to share experiences together. And another way I might say that is that, video, you might think of it as connecting people, but it really goes beyond that to giving people who are already connected ways to do things together. And that's a collection of projects that we have been experimenting with as a group. I think we are definitely continuing to explore in that mobile and asynchronous world. But that's, I think, some opportunities for future growth. So I think that's it. Thanks very much for your attention. And I'm glad to answer any questions. Yeah.
So this is really interesting. With regard to how it's used how video is used in the enterprise, I mean, it seems like two of the challenges, particularly with like global work, is that it is synchronous. So you do have all the time zone issues. I know you mentioned like video messaging basically didn't take off. So I'd be curious to hear more about that, and also like the fact that the formalities around video is still very much like you plan these like video conferences in advance, and so you can't just like go up to someone at the next desk, or you have to like initiate them all.
Right. So I do think that is what I think is an interesting opportunity with asynchronous messaging. So we did a project, I didn't mention this, it was presented at CHI, actually in Paris, on, 2 years ago, I guess, on something called time travel proxy, which enabled, what we wanted to do is allow asynchronous video messaging to give that sense of a globally remote person being there at the meeting. So the way it worked is that my colleagues in China, they want to attend this meeting that's happening in America. They record a message and send it in during their day. And then when we have the meeting here, I bring out a laptop or some physical proxy that's always playing a kind of a loop of them that gives you a sense that they're there virtually. And when the time in the meeting comes up for their contribution, we just sort of touch their little thought balloon, and that message plays as part of the meeting. But the interesting thing that we tried with that is something that we called reaction videos. That is, while we're playing that message, it's recording the meeting room. And so the remote person could get a sense of, did they get my joke? Were they confused? Did they agree? Did they disagree? All that natural reaction that happened in meetings could happen even though it was asynchronous, just by kind of recording the reaction video. And there have been a couple reaction video prototypes in the consumer space on phones as well for social communication. So we did play with using that to sort of bend this synchronous asynchronous boundary so that we could deal with the global time zone difference. And the question was, did both sides feel like they were kind of part of a meeting, even though this was kind of divvied up in time? And the answer was generally that the remote person felt like at least they were heard, and their contribution to the meeting was paid attention to, but getting the feedback back to them is sort of still a weak link. So it felt like we were able to address one side, but not sort of the reverse side. And I think that's an interesting way of maybe exploring using different ways of using asynchronous messaging to overcome that time zone, the global time zone difference.
Do you think it could work in something like email, for example? Like, by sending these messages, you can also get like some of the context around you, and obviously the size is an issue.
Well, I mean, of course, email was always an option for these people, and most.
Including video.
So one of the things that they said that I thought was interesting is that the social context of the meeting, being part of the social context of the meeting, gave them a sense that their contribution was heard. Whereas email is kind of a crapshoot nowadays. Is this person going to read it? Are they going to respond? Not as, but being part of a meeting, especially if you think about status report meetings or kind of pair program meetings where everyone kind of stands up and does their meetings that have a good structure to it, and people's participations kind of add up sequentially. We were thinking that this could be an interesting way of adding into that context. Cool. Yeah.
So this is sort of still in progress, but it created a connection in my head. We go way back and we see these continuous ever-present, we should be sharing all of our experiences through video all the time, always on, right? And this sort of didn't quite happen. And likewise, if you go to the in-person scenario, you have these situations like open plan environments where everyone's in the same open space sitting together. And recently I was speaking to someone who studies these open plan environments, and they said that one of the major reasons that these things fail is that there's interaction, but there's also just so much interference that it's ridiculous. And the way to get these things to succeed is to have an excuse, basically. So you have something like a kitchenette or a bathroom where people have to go at some point, and if there just happens to be sort of a hangout area nearby, they run into each other and they stick. And that's sort of like the unplanned hangout. And it seems like in some sense that's what's happening here too, is not that it's always on, that something like, as you say, like the kids' soccer game or something becomes this force that brings people together and gives them the excuse to just have this unstructured communication. And I'm wondering where we go from there. Like if her insight was right, what does that suggest for how we should be designing these systems differently?
Right. So it almost sounds like there's an attract mode that brings you into that space. And I do.
They're not going to be like, hey, I should go talk to John Tom, right, and like wander down to Microsoft. But if we both end up near the same place, we can go grab coffee.
Right. I mean, I do think that's an interesting area to explore. And even more so is whether it has to be synchronous, right? Could we create basically could you subscribe to some sort of stream of mine of interesting video messages that I'm publishing, and that could spur some conversation that could either be real time or could be asynchronous. I mean, I do think that's an interesting opportunity. It's sort of like what Facebook has done, although largely in text or in pictures. And the question is whether there's a role or there's a way that we could enrich in that with video. I think one of the interesting things to keep in mind is, what is video really good for, and not to try to, if a lower fidelity communication channel suffices, then people aren't going to go through the extra effort for using video. So what I think the question really then becomes, what are those events that really depend on video to make it worth sharing with you, or make it kind of attractive to have something together? And I think there could be an interesting opportunity to figure out how to filter, edit, or subscribe to a kind of a stream of those things that gets emitted or shared, and then used as a way to connect people together at convenient times. I think that's one of the things that we've been hearing about in looking at video messaging, is that although Skype calling is very convenient technically, it's becoming temporally inconvenient, right? That I have to dedicate a fixed block of time that I sit down and have this conversation, and I can't, and that can be relatively shackling. That while I'm doing that in a video call with someone, I'm not as free to go do other things, and I think that's sort of an interesting affordance of asynchrony. If we can still make it conversational and quote interactive, then it could allow us to deal with some of the constraints of scheduling that are inconvenient.
Cool.
We were talking about the Telepresence robot and how maybe that wasn't the form factor that you see going forward. I know that's kind of a big question, but do you have any idea where that might end up going?
I mean, I think I am not sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of room for opportunity. We often in our various projects, we often end up referring to a TV show called Max Headroom. This is, again, shows my age. But the sort of notion that, right, we live in a world where there are cameras all over the place, and maybe rather than physically moving a camera around, you just tap into it. But then the other problem is, well, then how do you represent yourself? But again, we live in a world where there are displays all over the place. And so maybe there's an opportunity to co-opt both the camera and the display side and not worry about physically moving something around as much as sort of creating or co-opting out of things that are just everywhere. We keep kind of dancing around that idea of not having to worry about locomoting, which is frankly the boring part about using a beam. Moving from point A, moving to point A to point B, you're driving along and going around. That's the boring part. The interesting part is that when you kind of, oh, really? Is that what you're saying? You just sort of, when you use the locomotion to direct your attention, and that sort of engage people, the sort of the local motion, not the locomotion, that's the more interesting usage of that. And I think that might be more interesting to think about. You know, that would really allow you to beam places, like not worry about locomoting there, but have the impact of being there. I think is the interesting opportunity. And in the back.
Moving, right? But Skype, and even if you move it to a cell phone, you still need the end motion. You have motions that are you can control it probably by arrows and move it around. But we have some motions that, as you said, with your dot wanted to look around the corner. It's motions that are part of us that we move, and we cannot always control them because there are different ways we look at things. So how do you compensate on that when you have, for example, you control the robot to move as a real person, not as something I can move around because I press right on the keyboard and it's turned around.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this addresses your question, but I think the other opportunity there is that we live in a world where everyone's kind of carrying a camera, and it might be interesting to be able to pick which view you want rather than physically moving a camera around. You just sort of hop from camera to camera until you find the view that you want. And so it's sort of controlling your view instead of moving one around. Just you move your point of view to whichever one captures the view that you're interested in. We thought about crowdsourcing that view as well.
So just an opinion question. Given your experience with, I guess, Corey's kids, what do you think of Vine? Like, in a sense, this is a sort of a Vine-y kind of feel.
Yeah.
Like, where's that going?
That's interesting. So what I like about this kind of explosion of video messaging tools is that people have been allowed to explore what constraints that define the medium are the most interesting. So the thing about Vine being so short, 6 seconds, I think has actually, in our interviews, shown up as almost a passing fad. It almost seems to be in the decline in terms of popularity, because what's happened with that 6 seconds, it's made it so precious that people have moved to very, very highly produced and edited videos, which is just a lot of work. And then it's raised the bar so high that I no longer do Vines. We keep running into people who say, oh, I used to do Vines, but I don't do it anymore. I'll watch Vines, but I don't make them anymore, because the bar has risen so high to cram all that creativity in those 6 seconds that it's not something that, it's not in my range anymore. And so I think has been curious to me. I love how Snapchat has been co-opted, or people, it gets a lot of press for being this medium for sexting or having things disappear because they're embarrassing. But I don't think what our understanding of how people are using Snapchat is that it relieves me totally of all the burden of managing, where videos are, like my inbox, right? I don't have to worry about cleaning it out. It just automatically expires out. And it enables a certain kind of communication, because it's known to be ephemeral, that I wouldn't do if I had that risk of being around. That's not anywhere near sexting as much as it's just sort of goofy and fun, and kind of, it's what connects me to you in a special way that, I don't want shared or broadcast around. So I think it's been really interesting to watch how each tool offers some kind of hook of a constraint, and that constraint can get co-opted or used in the way it was intended to, but it ends up taking a life of its own. But right, the Vine thing, I think it had this sort of, I think, unintended side effect that in order to get that into the 6 seconds, it's become sort of out of everyday use.
Other thoughts, questions? All right, we'll cut here. Let's thank Joe.
Thank you very much.